Okay, very warm welcome to this special guest presentation of Decolonising the Mind, Theory and Practice. Unfortunately, Martin Barge, who is due to co-chair, cannot be here due to unforeseen circumstances. We've got a very concise hour, and I'm really hoping to apportion some time for audience Q&A. So without any further preamble, it's a great pleasure to welcome our special guest speaker, Sandew Hira, pen name of Du Baburam, is secretary of the Decolonial International Network Foundation. He is co-editor of the book series Decolonising the Mind, together with Arzu Merabi of the Islamic Human Rights Commission and Professor Stephen Small from the University of California, Berkeley. Hira studied economics at the Erasmus University, Rotterdam in Holland, and he has written 25 books on different topics, among them colonial history. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Ashvin, for inviting me. Thank you, audience, for coming to listen and discuss with me about the topic what decolonizing the university means. I saw on the websites of different universities in the UK that there are quite a few universities that has decolonization as a topic on the website. I found some 30 universities, and just to give you a few of them here, you have University of Leeds, Metropolitan, Manchester University of York, Kiel, a lot of them. I was surprised by that because I thought, decolonization is such a sensitive topic, I'll come to it later, that you wonder how it is already on the agenda in the university. But if I look at what they view as decolonization, then it is quite different from what we look at decolonization from the global south. The issues which I found is about inclusive curriculum, inclusive meaning representation, that people of color have a voice in the curriculum, that you have a reading list from authors from the global south. It's about social struggle and injustice with issues of race, gender, sexuality, class. And then it comes to more the things which the global south looks into, epistemology, power relations, but then here you have the issues of pedagogy, voices that have been silenced. And this differs from what I see in the global south. I did a tour in Zambia and South Africa in May, since the launch of the book. I've been in different places. I was in Venezuela last month. And the discussion about decolonization is very different. Because here, representation, I imagine, is an issue because of demographics and Black Lives Matter and those influences. But obviously, representation is an issue in Zambia or South Africa. There, the issue is basically civilization. And here, you see a picture, a photo by Siswe Sikamusi from South Africa. I like this picture because it uses art to convey a concept. What is Western civilization? If the Westerners look in the mirror at their civilization, they see a beautiful apple. But when the global south look at it, from the perspective of global south, they see a rotten apple. And there's also because how we think that art contributes to knowledge production, because the way the visualization of the concept of a rotten civilization that looks at itself as a nice civilization, how do you say this in words? You could do it, you could write it, but putting it visually is a major contribution. So, the concept of civilization is at the core of what I call now decolonizing the mind theory. It links colonialism with civilization, and it has a vision of how to build a new world civilization moving out of the colonial world civilization, and what the role of the university is in this regard. So what is a civilization? It's a collection of societies with a specific cultural base, knowledge, ethics, views on how to organize and structure a society. So this cultural base, Buddhist civilization, Islamic civilization, the Maori civilization, they have a knowledge base that tells them, this is how I organize my economy. This is how the production of goods and services are organized. This is how we set up our political institutions, how we structure the relations between people who are ruled and people who are being ruled, how to organize social relations, relations between humans and nature, and how this cultural base is produced in knowledge. For example, in the ancient Egyptian civilization, the institution for producing knowledge were temples. It's not the universities as we know now. And how the knowledge is disseminated now through media and education. So this is the concept that is important. And it differs from an empire. An empire is a political unit that operates from a specific geographical center, country, the urban center, and controls nation and communities outside that center through an elaborate system of economic, political, social, and cultural institutions. What is colonialism? Colonialism is a global system of institutions, economic, political, and cultural, that the global north has created since 1492 in order to rule the world in a colonial world civilization. So, if this is the theoretical context of how to look at civilization, then you can understand that decolonizing the university is first and foremost a critique of European civilization. We look into the base of European civilization and ask ourselves the question, how did colonialism create a civilization that instituted this global system of injustice, where people were enslaved, where genocide were taking place in Abya, the term for Latin America and the Americas, where colonialism has degraded human beings. How did this came about? And how was it reflected in knowledge production? So decolonizing the university looks at the civilizational aspect of European civilization and offers the critique. And it studies the impact of colonialism on knowledge production and science, and then argues that we need to reconstruct the science. The role of the university is reconstruct the discipline. And here I come with a critique of the decolonial movement. The decolonial movement have made big progress by putting forward the proposition that colonialism has not ended with political independence, has not ended even with economic independence, but has this aspect of knowledge production. And much of it is a critique, and that's fine, that's where we are. But now, my point is we need to go beyond the critique. After we have read Fanon and all the others, we should ask ourselves the question, what's next? What do we do? What's the practical implication of decolonial theory? And my argument is we need to go to the reconstruction of the disciplines and how to talk about decolonizing economic theory, mathematics, physics, biology, social theory, cultural theory, political theory. And in order to make that transition from general critique to developing an alternative and the reconstruction of discipline, you have to understand the history of colonial world civilization and its knowledge base. European civilizations and its empires exist for a very short time, 500 years. The first 150 years, this knowledge base was Christian theology. And after that, the European Enlightenment. So So you see how the different empires colonized the world, the Spanish, Portuguese, the Dutch, the Belgians, the French, the Germans, the Italians, here the British Empire. We said the sun never sets, and now the sun sets at 800 hour and gets down at 1600. You have the American military bases, which is, American Empire is very young, 50 years, 70 years. So we're talking about a young civilization compared to other civilizations, which lasted for 1,000 years. It introduced racism on a global scale in knowledge production, and the organization of society with the notion of inferiority and superiority, and it's based on the colonization of the mind. Now, to understand these two foundations of European civilization, this graph is very telling. This graph gives the number of people who have been kidnapped from Africa, brought to Abya, the Americas, and you could see here in 1650 onwards, it really took off. The rise of the transatlantic enslavement coincides with the rise of the European Enlightenment. So, in the first 150 years, Christian colonialism had depopulated Abya. And one author recounts that for every 20 natives alive at the moment of European contact, only one stood in the place when the bloodbath was over. So millions of people were killed in Abya, and that forced Europe to build a global economy, forced labor from Africa, set up the colonial economic system with the production of minerals and agricultural products, processing of it in Europe, and this required technological development and the rise of science. And the Christian caliphate hindered the technological development. So science had to fight against Christian theology. And the pillars of the global economy was based on the transatlantic slavery, the triangular trade of Europe, Africa, Abya, the rise of banking and insurance, the processing industry in Europe, the development of infrastructure, and all this based on technology and science. So technology and science came in conflict with Christian theology. In Christian theology, I give you this example, the authority of knowledge were Christian theologians. And here you see the example of a bishop, James Usher, who calculated the date that God created the universe by looking at the Bible, where people could become 900 years, constructed the genealogy as you see here, and calculated that God created the universe at 6 p.m. on 2022, October 4004 BCE. He was the authority of knowledge, and the reason you laugh about it, because you don't accept this as authority of knowledge. You've been grown into the European Enlightenment and said this is nonsense, you see. But at that time it wasn't seen as nonsense. So Christian theology and science were in such a conflict that you have this example of Bruno and Galileo. Bruno was burned alive and Galileo was sentenced to prison, life in prison, because of the theory of the earth revolving around the sun. So the new knowledge base, which arose out of the economic necessity of the transition from the destruction of the population in Abya and the rise of transatlantic slavery, produced a knowledge base which was secular. And the foundation of the European Enlightenment production, it introduced an epistemology in which natural and social science use the same method of research in detecting natural and social laws, so-called natural and social laws. It introduced racism in knowledge production and introduced mental slavery. So if we study the way knowledge was produced in European and non-European civilizations, I come to the following. The object of knowledge. In the European civilization, the object of knowledge is only the observable world. In non-European civilization, the object of knowledge is the observable world and also a non-observable world, a spiritual world from which ethics are derived. The source of knowledge in Europe was only observation and reasoning. That is how it developed. In non-European epistemology, besides observation and reasoning, you have innate knowledge, common sense, social interactor, creativity, and imagination. The method of knowledge production in Europe, the method of knowledge production for natural and social science are the same. Mathematics is basics for both science, induction and deduction, separation of ethics from knowledge, the use of two-value logic, true and false. These are within the European methodology of knowledge production. In the non-European methodology of knowledge production, there's a difference between natural and social science. In the social science, ethics are intertwined with knowledge, and logic goes beyond true and false. In the Indian Jainism, they have 7 values of logic. And then the purpose of knowledge. In European epistemology, they are claiming to seek the truth, but there's also a purpose of knowledge production which is producing lies, the colonization of the mind. And in the non-European epistemology, it's about seeking the truth and decolonizing the mind. And then the use of knowledge production. In Europe, there are no ethical limits to the use of knowledge production. For example, the development of nuclear weapons. In non-European civilizations, some societies had no restrictions, but others had restrictions on how to use knowledge. You know, I give the example of Columbus and the Chinese general Shanghai in the book, where the same discovery voyages had in Columbus no limitations on how to commit genocide, while these were explicitly there in the voyage of Shanghai. Now, we study the civilizations, and we see how in the universities, the European Enlightenment is the basis of the structure of universities. And now when I say the purpose of decolonizing the mind is putting that on the table, it could be threatening because civilization is identity. So if you discuss this in the context of identity formation, white people might see it as a critique on their whiteness and rather than a critique of the civilization that produced that. Mind you, within the European Enlightenment, there was also a critique of the European Enlightenment based on the concept of justice. And the whole tradition of Marxism, socialism, anarchism, all these kind of humanism were there. Even in Christian theology, the earliest liberation theologists were already in Santo Domingo and in Mexico. So, what we do, we look at the colonization of the mind, we do the critique, and then set up the question, what is the alternative for the critique? If you have a critique of, let's say, Euro-mathematics, what's your alternative? If you have a critique of economic theory, what is your alternative? If you have a critique of philosophy, what's the alternative? Once you articulate the alternative, then the question is, what's the practical relevance of it? How do you translate this in viable policies? So, let me give you now one basic element of DTM epistemology, which is conceptual thinking. The concept is a basic unit of knowledge, I argue, and a concept is an idea that describes and explains certain aspects of the social and natural world. And a concept consists of 5 elements. One is terminology. Columbus the Discoverer is a terminology from Eurocentrism on how to look at the voyages of Columbus. While the indigenous people of Ayala use Columbus the criminal. It's a different terminology for the same observation of the voyages of Columbus. So how you use terminology and language as part of a concept is crucial. Also in understanding how the mind has been colonized. Then observation, the collection of facts. So the story of Columbus was the story of finding a new route to Asia. And that's a different story than the story of the kidnapping of Tainos and the story of Rodrigo de Triana, the guy who was on the ship, discovered land, sheltered land, and the king had said the one who did it would get 10,000 ducats. And when Columbus came back, he said he sheltered land, and Rodrigo de Triana didn't get it. So the element of greed, which was embedded in the voyage of Columbus, was left out, those observations. And then you have observations, you have terminology, but then you have to put it into an analysis, into a storyline. And the storyline was the discovery of the new world. It's a different storyline than the storyline of the analysis of genocide. And then you put the concept in relation to other concepts. A theory is a collection of interrelated concepts that provides a bigger picture of the natural and social reality. Now, the theory in which discovery fits is the theory of the rise of modernity, which is a different theory than the theory of the decline of human civilizations. And finally, ethics, which is left out in European epistemology, because it's only about true or false, and ethics is about good and bad. Now, if you use the ethics, hidden ethics of the story of Columbus, you set up 600 statues, which are now across the world. And if you say Columbus is a criminal, you argue for the destruction of those statues. So this is a different epistemology. And to understand now how this epistemology differs from European epistemology, you have to understand the development of European philosophy and the idea that before the modernity, there was no science. That is the argument for a long time in Eurocentrism. You argue that Eurocentrism science is objective. Yes, there can be a bias, but basically what we do with science, we produce objective knowledge. And objective knowledge means it is universal. It is not only true in Europe. The law of gravity goes for the whole universe. The law of economics goes for the whole economic world. Objective knowledge was developed in Europe. It didn't exist outside of Europe. Rationalism was something that arose in Europe. Rationalism, where people were thinking with their mind, arose in Europe. In other parts of the world, people were thinking with their ass. And from here, the step to superiority is now small. Objective knowledge is superior to knowledge that is not based on the canon of Eurocentric epistemology, and then European science becomes superior. And superior knowledge comes from white Europeans, so racism is embedded in science. Then you have 3 phases of the development of racism in science. Theological racism, where the concept of superiority and inferiority is argued from theology and linked to theologians and the authority of knowledge production. Biological racism, where inferiority and superiority is argued from philosophy and natural science and biology, and is linked to the philosophers of the Enlightenment. And cultural racism, where it is not about biology, but about backward culture, and argued from the social science. Here, in the 1550, the debate of Valladolid, between two theologians were setting the basis for superiority, inferiority based on Christian theology, where the question and the debate was, is it lawful for the King of Spain to wage wars on the Indians before preaching the faith to them in order to subject them to his rules so that afterwards they may be easily instructed in faith? Meaning, basically, it is right to invade a country to bring Christianity. And this basis is until today. It is right to invade Iraq to bring democracy. Now, biological racism shifts from theology to philosophy and natural sciences. It separates science from theology. It hides ethics, and the natural sciences uses biology to classify human beings. So here you have the major philosophers of the European Enlightenment, Charles de Montesquieu, about black people. Those concerned are black from head to toe, and they have such flat noses that it's impossible to feel sorry for them. Voltaire, the round eyes, the flattened nose, the lips which are always large, the differently shaped ears, the wool of the head, the very measure of their intelligence place prodigious differences between them and other species of man. Hume, I'm apt to suspect the Negroes and in general all the other species of man, there are 4 or 5 different kinds, to be naturally inferior to the whites. Kant, the Negroes from Africa have by nature no feelings that rises above the ridiculous. Hegel, the Negro has already observed, exhibits the natural man in his complete wild and untamed state. I'm talking about the giants of the European Enlightenment. I'm not talking about small philosophers somewhere. I'm talking about the foundation, and if Hitler would read that, he would be ashamed. Because Hitler didn't even say this kind of things. Darwin, who compared apes to the gorillas. Arthur Gobineau was, at those times, we don't know him now, wrote an essay where he had on the equality of races, where he classified white race being superior, intelligent, yellow, mediocre, and black and brown, stupid. And that is how it looks like with things of today. Now, cultural racism comes up with the rise of social science, the legal abolition of enslavement and the colonization of Asia, Middle East, and the rest of Africa. The articulation of superiority and inferiority is now based not on biology, but on culture. All human beings are biologically equal, but their culture are not equal, and they develop from lower to simpler phase of life to a higher and complex phase. And Western society is the higher and most complex phase of human civilization. You get it in the theory of Darwinism, where Spencer and Malthus articulated this idea of the strong succeeded wealth and power increase. Nazism took it over, that's why it got discredited. Kant formulated the law of 3 stages: zoological, metaphysical, and positive stage. And in positive stage, science and knowledge is based on observation and experiment. Weber, who argued that Europe is civilized not because of colonialism, but because of the religion, which enables technological, economic, and cultural development. So what do you see now? Colonialism has impacted knowledge production. It's impacted knowledge production in all the disciplines. I mentioned philosophy, world history. I could go into the different disciplines, philosophy, mathematics, you call it. So, let me leave this one. I'll go on to mathematics. Because people could say, how can you decolonize 1 and 1 is 2? Well, by studying the development of Euro-mathematics. In Euro-mathematics, have made great advances, many fields. But there's also a strength in Euro-mathematics that disconnected empirical observation from mathematical rules. And at the end of the day, mathematics became founded on the concept of an axiom. An axiom is a proposition that doesn't need proof. You just have to accept it. That's true. And And if you do that, you develop some strange things in mathematics. For example, if you would calculate what is 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5 plus till eternity, anybody with the right mind would say, oh, if I give you $1, $2, $3, you end up immensely rich. The calculation, the result of the calculation is -1 divided by 12. How is that possible? You get $1, $2, $3 and you end up in debt. It doesn't match common sense. And yet, it is developed in the theory by Indian mathematician Ramanujan, and it's there in the textbooks. I can give you more examples in mathematics. Now, if we say that looking at the different disciplines, we now acknowledge that there's something called mental slavery, which is a completely distorted view of reality. Here you see the Mercator method, which is used now across the world. In this map, Africa and Greenland appear the same size, while Africa is 14 times larger than Greenland. So the sizes are distorted. Here is one map with the more correct sizes. If now we turn the Gauss-Peters map upside down, you get totally confused. Yet you are living in this world. But it's the way you look at this world. If you're accustomed to look at this world only through this map, through that glance, this is confusing. This is, you can't deal with the world anymore. Take Africa. The population of Africa is bigger than that of China. You know, Africa as a whole. The area of Africa is almost 3 times that of China. And yet when you talk about Africa and China, you have the feeling that you're talking about identities where Africa is much larger, with a larger population than Africa. So what happens now? We argue that knowledge production has been colonized, and the task of the university is to decolonize knowledge. So I'm not talking about representation, which is important. I think we need to have more people of color in the university at the level of research and staff and management. That goes without saying. But for me, that's not decolonization if you've done that. It is about, first of all, studying how colonialism has impacted the disciplines. Let me give you an example, economic theory. Economic theory is presented as objective theory. The law of demand and supply is an objective law. You know the graph where you have the supply and demand, and then economic theory tells you that the higher the demand is, the higher the price goes. An Islamic scholar, Muhammad Bakir al-Sana, discussed Eurocentric economic theory and argued what is the force behind supply and demand. Adam Smith says it's basically profit maximization. Everybody goes after his own, and that profit maximization gives you this result. But Muhammad Bakir al-Sana says, what you call profit maximization, we call greed, is an ethical value. And that ethical value is the underlying base of the economic theory. So now, if we reconstruct economic theory, we reconstruct it in what is the ethical base of your economic theory. So when we reconstruct the discipline, we first look at how colonialism has impacted the basic concepts. What are the concepts? What are the core concepts in social theory, in gender theory, in film and cinema, in language, in mathematics, in physics? what are the core concepts on the basis of which the discipline has been erected? How did colonialism impact them? And then comes the question, had other people not already thought about this? Were there no other thinkers in other civilizations who thought about how to construct a just economy? It must have been. But if you discard those civilizations as backward, you don't look at it. Now, once you have the critique, you have the Eurocentric concept, you have the critique, you have other concepts, then you make an assessment. Is this good enough to develop the disciplines? Do we need new concepts? How do we relate them to old concepts? What are the policy implications? And then you outline the methodology of the disciplines. So, what methods do we use to further construct the disciplines? Let's take, for example, sociology. Social theory, today you write an article in social theory, it doesn't have a table and a graph and a formula, it's low quality. The high quality social articles have graphs and in economics they have econometrics, now they have social metrics, they have psychometrics. So you would wonder, is there other methodology in understanding human relations? Well, one of the scholars from Sudan argues, because we are humans, our understanding of what humans are, how they function, comes from innate knowledge, comes from knowledge about how we live as human beings. It's a different methodology. So, what I did in the book, I went through all the different disciplines. And the only way I could do it is because I love science. And I love science since I was 17 years, and I've been reading all kinds of disciplines. I love mathematics, I love physics, and I love economics. So if you read a lot in the last 50 years, and in the last 12 years I went through it systematically, then you will see, but in the different disciplines, decolonization means different things. It's not just a critique. You could have a critique of the foundation of your mathematics, a critique of the axiomatic approach. You could have a critique of the historical view, of the use of mathematics in natural and social sciences. The idea of the concept of reverse engineering. How did they construct the pyramids without knowing the formulas which we know now? How did they do it? What mathematics did they use? How do we set up a new system of the education of mathematics? And how do we critique the ethics of mathematics? So that's mathematics. In physics, we could look into how does physics works with the logic of Aristotle. And you find branches in physics where the logic of Aristotle, which is about true and false, doesn't work. Because there are areas where things are true and false. And take, for example, the use of secular theology in the Big Bang Theory, which is presented now as the most accurate theory of the universe. So let's take biology. A friend of mine, professor in biology in Venezuela, Guillermo Barreto, who taught for 30 years the theories of Darwin and so, when he started with decolonizing biology, he explained to me how in the study of living organisms, the concept of liberalism and individualism and competition was transferred in how you study animals. And he says, the survival of the fittest, if you study animal kingdom of animals, you'll see that yes, you will find that, but you will also find social organization of animals, where they work together rather than compete in surviving. So he outlined many aspects where you can decolonize biology, decolonize economics, goes into the ethics, the purpose of economics, the evaluation of non-economic theories. So, when I talk about decolonizing now in the universities, and because we are in the Department of Linguistics and Film, I thought, it would be interesting to have a conversation about what it means to decolonize, let's say, linguistics. A friend of mine of the University of Western Cape, Professor Basia Antia, had a long conversation with me, a conversation about the relationship between language and colonization and decolonization. Basically, we try to reorganize the study of linguistics. There's a field of linguistics, applied linguistics, that looks into the relationship between society and linguistics. But then we go a step further and say, how does the structure of knowledge interact with the role of language? For example, I gave the idea of how the use of terminology, Columbus the discoverer, Columbus the criminal, how terminology impacts knowledge, impacts the structure of knowledge. You could go into other kinds of studies where you could study the impact of the language, the structure of language, how does it limits your understanding of knowledge? Oyaranka Oyurumu wrote the book, The Invention of Women. And she found that in the Yoruba language, most names and all pronouns are ungendered. They don't have a name for men and women. They don't have a name for father and mother. So if you do gender studies, how does the language impact the way you study social relations in the Yoruba culture? Now, let's take film. You study film, you study cinema. What is the purpose of studying cinema? Why are we studying cinema? What is the purpose? What is the concept that are used in studying film, cinema? Is it a study of the technique? How do you produce film? How do you edit? How do you, build a storyline? Do you take the study of films in connection of the colonization of the mind? How does the structure of cinema is impacted by mental slavery? So these are things, which requires a lot of discussions, but the basic concept that I developed in this book is that decolonizing the university is really not about representation. It's a small part, and it's important, and we need to do it. Because if you don't do it, you're going to lag behind. By bringing in people, with a different civilizational experience, you have a conversation about Western civilization, Western knowledge production. But basically, decolonizing the university is about looking at the impact of how the university was formed by Western civilizations, enforces Western civilizations, how that civilization became a civilization of injustice, and how we need to go through a reconstruction of the discipline and look how we can build a better world civilization that fulfills the aspirement of human beings to live in peace, harmony, love, and welfare. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for that lucid presentation. Before opening out to questions, I have a quick question. On page 376, you talk about culture. Culture is institutionalized in educational institutions that produce knowledge. So again, we have that kind of nexus between institutions and knowledge production. So do you have any thoughts on practical suggestions on how to instantiate or implement let's say in fields like film studies, the visual arts, performing arts, practical mechanisms to kind of put into practice decolonizing.
Right. Now, let's take the research program. You know, so you set up a study and you have a research program that produces the empirical and theoretical knowledge about film studies. Now, the first thing I will argue, how are film studies now studied? How's the structure of the theory of film studies? So, what is the theory about? Look, in let's say economic theory, it's about the production and distribution of goods and services, and the Eurocentric version of it, it's about scarcity, and the non-Eurocentric version is about injustice. So you have the study of the production and the distribution and financing of it, and then you have different views on how you look at it. Now, in film studies, my first counter question would be, what are the basic concepts that are used in film studies? Is it technical? Is it, we think that a story could be told in this and this way, and if you produce a film, this is how you can use light and sound and etc. Is that the thing? Okay. If now we would look from a decolonial perspective, I would argue that how does colonialism impacted this? And then when I look at film studies, not being an expert on film studies, I already see, but being looking at films, you know, we all watch films, in television, etc. I see a lot of mechanisms of the colonizing of the mind in the film industry. You don't have to be an expert. You just use common sense. And then you see what Hollywood has produced and how you look at the world is basically Europe, the Western civilization, as the civilization of liberty, freedom, etc. It's not a civilization of death, of genocide. See? So the study of film, the practical application is how does your research program take into account the impact of colonialism in the structure of the study, in the way storylines are constructed, and the technical details, and then comes the second thing. Is there a better alternative possible? Can you have a different form of cinema, etc., that satisfies human needs in terms of, you know, recreation, but also education, about what kind of values, you know, can one do. So that is the way I would look at a film.
Thank you. Any audience questions?
Thank you very much for this very generative, inspiring lecture, which I will go back to several times, I'm sure. I was wondering which epistemological strategies we can think of to sort of to implement an analysis to prevent ourselves from kind of falling into a binarism of European and non-European cultural or civilizational blocks in historiography as we decolonize institutions. What kind of, there's many obviously, but I'm curious as to, you know, the examples that you feel like offering.
Right. Now, take basic discipline, philosophy. Right? So, if we look at decolonizing philosophy, we could study Western philosophy, offer a critique of it. That is one line. But you could go into another line. You could say, what was the problem the philosophers were struggling with? Let's say, for example, Descartes. Right? Descartes, who is seen as the founder of European philosophy, struggled with this question of how do I know that I'm not dreaming, that I exist? Because my senses can deceive me. So how do I know? And he created a methodology for it. He called it hyperbolical doubt. He doubted everything. And when he doubted everything, he said, the only thing I cannot doubt is that I think is there. That's why he said, I think, therefore I am. Now, you could critique it. You could say, what does it mean to say, I don't think, therefore I am not? So what does it mean to say, I think, therefore I am? How can you doubt your existence, which goes against common sense? Now then you go into, how do the African philosophers look at it? And the African philosophers say, in our epistemology, we see social interaction as a source of knowledge. How do I know that I'm dreaming? Because somebody wakes you up, hey, wake up. So the source of knowledge is social interaction. Chinese philosopher a few thousand years ago, took on the same issue of dreaming. But then he created the imagination. He is saying he was dreaming that he was a fly. But now, the more he was thinking about it, he wondered, was it me dreaming that I'm a fly, or was it the fly dreaming that I'm me? He's human. What I'm saying is this. You look at a problem that a society deals with. I took epistemology, but I could take economics. How do you organize your society economically? And then you study how did other people think about it. And then you see that there's one strand in Eurocentrism, which was liberal economy, but there was another one which has social injustice in the theory. It was Marxism, labor theory of value. So theory was injustice. And then you could say, okay, but in Buddhism, for example, they argue that the economy should be towards bettering also the spiritual life of people. Right? So how do you go beyond the binary by looking at the problem and how the different people thought about it?
Thank you for your lecture. It was very inspiring. I'm coming from Latin America, from Brazil, and I have been working with social movements and some of the decolonizing gender. And something that I would like to bring here and to discuss is like, I think it's very important when we think about decolonization and would like to know what to think about intersectionality. Because when we like in terms of I work with them in terms of agroecology, and then when we take agroecology just as a science, we have one thing. But when we put together agroecology as a social movement, and agroecology also as practice, and looking what women are doing, for instance, they are saying that we need to consider in agroecology is the way that to avoid like gender violence, and if about taking care of nature, and nature implies thinking about human beings and not human beings, and then in the democratization of care, they are bringing a lot of things, and I think how I would like to have your thoughts about this. It's not about join all of this in terms of thinking policies, because it's, as you said, it's about the critique, but we need to go beyond the critique and how we join together what we have, and a university can learn also from social movements. I'm Brazil from a university. I'm here as a visiting researcher, working here, studying as well. But what I'm saying is like to hear about this connection.
Clear. Thank you. Well, one of the arguments in the book is that the producers of knowledge now, in the global world, not only in Europe, the producers of knowledge are academics. They study, do research, they produce knowledge. argue that there are other producers of knowledge. For example, leaders of social movements, spiritual leaders, produce knowledge. One of the greatest producers of knowledge is a singer. You know, Redemption Song by Bob Marley produced the concept of mental slavery. And it was based on Marcus Garvey, who in the 30s came up with this concept of mental slavery. You know, and then Bob Marley developed it, emancipate yourself from mental slavery, none but yourselves can free our mind. And you take those concepts by social movement and they developed it in a whole theory of decolonizing the mind. This is based on Garvey. I'm not that intelligent that I think of it all. I study a lot, but I study a lot what other people have thought and say, oh wow, this guy, this woman said this, you know, this is what we can use. So take the concept of humans and nature. In Western scientific development, there became a separation of humans and nature. There are humans are superior to other forms of life, so the humans are entitled to manipulate life. And then when they do that, they found they are in trouble, that there's something they call ecosystem. If you do that, you get the climate change problem, you get all kinds of problems, which the manipulation of nature by humans didn't foresee, and science didn't foresee. In Bolivia, they have the concept of Pachamama, Mother Earth, where they argue that nature has intelligence. So they would argue that animals, trees, mountains, etc., that they have intelligence, but if you translate that as intelligence, you say people are crazy. How can you say a mountain is intelligent? So what the closest you come with your language is ecosystem. That is how you translate the thing. So you say, oh, there's an ecosystem, that is how it functions. That is what they mean. And they say you should respect the ecosystem, you should respect the mountains and the animals. And if you construct a theory about relations of humans, then you get a different policy. And they argue, for example, for a declaration of the rights of Mother Earth, you know, which like the Declaration of Human Beings. So there's a different policy implication from that concept of Pachamama. So yes, I could deal with a lot of other things, but I think that we are almost done.
Yeah, we have time for one more question, one last quick question. Anyone?
Thank you. I wanted to ask, to what extent do you think that this kind of reframing of knowledge is compatible with the institution of the university as it currently stands? Because it seems to me that the tendency here, at least, is to entrench those, especially economically, because the university is a corporate institution. So to what extent do you think that this kind of slow, patient, persistent reframing of knowledge can actually lead to a real institutional, to change the institution at its core?
Yes. I'm by nature very optimistic. And the reason I'm by nature very optimistic is that I study world history. And I see how immense the progress is that mankind has made. Despite all the problems we have now, transatlantic slavery is gone. You know, a lot of things humankind has been able to solve. But there are a lot of problems there. Now, I argue the fact in itself that 30-something plus universities in the UK are discussing this tells you that there is progress. But this progress comes against the institutional organization of the university, which is now set up as a corporation, not as an institute for knowledge, as an institute for selling knowledge. Like you sell pens, you sell apples. So if you set up the university like that, it goes against this idea that an institute for knowledge production and distribution is something else than a marketing institute. So I think that tension sooner or later will come to the fore, or maybe it's already there. And putting the question, is the structure of the university adequate for decolonizing knowledge? And if that's not the case, if it's inadequate, what kind of other structures should we think of? And then it comes to imagination. What can we think of? Because if we go and look what we have now, you will be very pessimistic, of how it's being structured. But my point is, we are only a few hundred years in the 350 years to be exactly of the European Enlightenment. There were other civilizations for 1,000 years. So we have a long time to go, and I'm sure that the trend of it is in putting to discussion the question of what is the role of the university in society. And I think these discussions will go on, and the student bodies and the faculties might be against the management, where the management doesn't, is on the line of selling knowledge rather than producing knowledge.
Right, I think we've come to the end of our hour, but thank you very much for coming.